So just to kind of set the stage in terms of how this has evolved, this has been like 2 years, really, in the evolution. And so the beginning was the fact that we need to assess for AACSB. They're very interested in how we assess and teach ethics. And so the impetus for this project was the need to assess ethics from the AACSB perspective. And so that's how I got started. First of all, we did a literature review, and it showed that what we need to do in terms of assessing ethics is look at whether or not students can identify an ethical issue. That's sort of number one. The second is how they apply ethical theories to the dilemma. And the third issue that's really clear in the literature is, can they identify the impact on stakeholders of the decisions? So those are the three learning outcomes that we saw in the literature. From that, we developed a rubric and a case study that we could give to the students, have them assess the ethical issue, apply the ethical theories, and then determine the impact on stakeholders. So we developed the case, we developed the rubric, and then we actually implemented that for, I'm thinking, 3 semesters. 2 semesters we had pretty dismal scores by the students. Then we changed the instructions for the case, and we had slightly higher scores. And then we decided we needed to refine what we were doing based on what we were seeing. So at that point, when I was looking at, I'm definitely not an ethical expert. I have had ethics classes, many of us have, but it looked to me that from what I was seeing in our textbooks, they use different terminology. It is very confusing, not only to students, but to faculty also. So at that point, I decided, this was last spring, I decided that we needed content experts. Essentially, what we're doing is a writing exercise. So I asked Sonia Brown for input on how to develop the instructions to the students so that they would understand what we were looking for. So I got feedback from Sonia Brown on the writing part of it. Then I went to Greg to become our content expert in ethics, to help us sort through the terminology and the things we need to do to teach and assess ethics. So for the future, what we want to do is to provide a support for faculty in terms of teaching ethics in the classroom, because eventually this is going to come full circle. We're assessing it now, but what are we doing about teaching ethics in the classroom? So that will sort of be the next wave. In the beginning, when I talked to Greg, we looked at the literature, and honestly there's very little about teaching business ethics. You would think there was a lot. There's a lot about ethics, and there's a lot about ethics in business, but there's very little on teaching ethics in business. So there is the pedagogy piece, which will be our next step, is like how to get across those concepts in the classroom in the best possible way so that our assessment will show improvement. So that's kind of where we are. And I just wanted to sort of lay the stage for this workshop today so you'll kind of see the bigger picture. With that, Greg, Sadler, and I have developed a project that we call Ethics in Business Education. We have a website under development where there will be a lot of resources posted, and then a series of training sessions. So that's kind of where we are. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg.
Okay. Thanks for bringing me in here. I'd like to, before I go into the presentation, I'd like to show you the website. Like Beth said, it is under development, and I've just started to put content into it. It gives you an overview of the project itself, and a lot of that is along the lines of what Beth has just talked about. One idea behind this project is a certain model of collaboration. When it comes to business ethics, in a lot of schools, business ethics ends up being taught by philosophy professors. And I think sometimes there's an impression given to the undergraduates especially, who are taking those classes, that ethics is something you do in philosophy. It's not something that really has to do with business. And you get through that business ethics class so you can get on with the real work. What that leads to is sort of a differentiation of specializations. The business people do the business, the philosophers do the ethics, and the two don't have to mix. Some people like that model still. When I proposed this idea to one of my colleagues, she said, the only way I'm coming in on this is if we get to teach business ethics. The business people can stay out of it. And I don't think that's a very good model. Instead, the idea is we as content experts in ethics can help you to disentangle some of the things that are confused in the textbooks, some of the curriculum issues that might come up. We've been teaching ethics for a while, and there are certain problems that keep coming up in classes over and over again trying to teach it. So we can help you with that, but ultimately the goal is for you guys to be teaching ethics, for you to become not necessarily the experts at the top level of expertise, but you might say at an intermediate level. And then that should have a good trickle-down effect to the students. So the type of collaboration in this project is laid out on the website. I've just started putting who's involved in it on the website as well. Michelle Darnell, who I think some of you remember from before, she's now at the University of Florida. She was hired to put together their business ethics program down there. She's agreed to come on as a partner to help out. We're going to see if we can maybe get her to come up here. I've got a discussion of our short-term projects, including the one that we're going to focus on this semester, the grading rubric. The workshops, the materials for this are going to be posted there. They're already there. We will eventually have working papers. We don't have any right now. And I have a site which is going to contain discussions of main ethical theories. Right now, I'm a little bit behind, and I've only got the one for egoism up. And that one isn't quite finished yet, but I'm going to, over the next weeks, I'm going to be adding more and more content to that. And then eventually we're going to be putting a lot of resources on here as well. So
not to forget our literature review.
Yes.
We're going to be posting constantly journal articles related to the topic, so that'll be there.
Yeah, and eventually we hope this will result in some publications, both for people in business and in philosophy. So I think this could be a really useful collaborative effort. Anybody who wants to be involved in it and get your face and name up on the board is welcome to. So with all of that said,
is the site live and people can access it, or you say it's in development?
That means both. That means that it's up.
It's up, but it's evolving.
Exactly. Yeah. You can reach it. We've got it hosted on my faculty webpage right now because that gives me enough autonomy. I don't have to consult IT or anybody about what I put up there because that takes a while. So the idea is we want to get as much material up as quickly as possible. Maybe once we actually get the site finished, we can migrate it over to the School of Business and Economics.
So you go through www.uncfsu/Sadler or what?
The best thing to do to get to my personal webpage is to go to the FSU webpage, do a search under Sadler.
Okay.
There is a several click way of actually getting. There's a difference between your faculty page and your faculty webpage, right?
Okay.
This is my faculty page that I'm allowed to develop as much as I want to. So, all right. So there we go. What we're going to go over today is fairly straightforward, and the goals and the scope of this workshop. So ethics is complicated. We often want to frame things in ways that simplify it. We have to do that for our students, but as a subject matter, it's fairly complicated. So one of the first things I want to stress is that this workshop is not designed to make everybody into an expert on ethics. It's just designed to give you the sort of most barest outlines of some ethical theories. It doesn't address every single ethical theory. Just addresses the ones that you are probably most likely to come across in business ethics literature. There's actually a few other ones that you will come across as well, but I wanted to keep it to 5 just because that seems to be a manageable number for me. The goal here is just to help business faculty with one specific knowledge and skill area. And I don't presume that any of you well, I assume actually that all of you, when you were undergraduates, you probably took an ethics class in whatever undergraduate institution you were in, and I would guess that you probably took several different business ethics classes as a business major and then in your graduate education as well. So you have exposure to this. The key question here for this workshop is, what do you need to know to assess students' knowledge and application of ethical theories? This is tied to that rubric. One of the sections on the rubric requires you to be able to evaluate whether students actually convey understanding of an ethical theory. So in order for you to be able to do that, you have to know what the ethical theories are. We're not going to go into anything like, where do ethical theories come from, what is their ultimate basis, which one is better or worse, or anything like that. That's beyond the scope of this workshop. So we're being very pragmatic here. So what do you need to know to assess? Sure.
We usually put it like by the trash can.
Okay. There we go. So what do you need to do to carry this out, to use the rubric? You have to have basic understanding of each ethical theory, because otherwise you can't tell if your students do. That's sort of a no-brainer. Darn it. Yeah. Well, let me talk in the meantime while we wait for this thing to fire back up. What else do you need to know about ethical theories? You have to know enough to be able to tell whether the student is applying them correctly. So it's not just enough to know the principles of the ethical theory, or oftentimes people want to talk in terms of the definition of an ethical theory. You also have to have some understanding of what you'd be looking for in a student response applying it. So with some of these it's very easy. Utilitarianism is one that the business ethics textbooks tend to get right most of the time. And it's one that we're all very familiar with because utilitarian cost-benefit type calculations are carried out routinely in business. Right? So being able to figure out whether a student is applying that correctly, that doesn't take quite so much. When it comes to some of the more, at least from a business perspective, more obscure ethical theories like, say, care ethics or deontology, it might be a little bit more difficult to figure out exactly what constitutes a good response for students. We'll wait for this to fire up. Actually, do you have any questions at this point while we're waiting for this to get back online?
Well, one of the things we noticed too were the textbooks call these principles, sets of principles, different things too.
Yeah.
Right, and part of what you're going to cover is to help us connect the dots, sort of, or group them.
Yeah. In the sense that the textbooks provide two different kinds of misleading or confusing information, from what I've seen. Some of it is confusing because they're calling the same thing by several different names.
Yeah, okay.
So eventually we're going to be putting together a glossary that will provide you sort of index. This is called this, and I actually want to tie it to specific textbooks. This is called this in this textbook. this author calls this, these are common names, this is the same concept. At other times it gets confusing because the author is actually making something up and calling it by a commonly used name in ethical theory. For instance, I found one author using the term relativism in a really non-standard way, which wouldn't be misleading if you already knew what relativism means in the discipline of ethics. But if it's your first exposure to it, you're going to think that's what it means. So for us, it's not that big of a problem. For our students, it is. You know, in our core curriculum here at FSU, ethics is not part of our core curriculum. In many other institutions, state or private institutions, an ethics class is something you're expected to take. So you get introduced to that terminology. We can't presume that here. So if the students are getting terminology that's confusing in a textbook and they're encountering it for the first time, we really can't in a way we can't fault them for getting mixed up about it. We're telling them they have to use these textbooks. Why aren't we connecting to the
Just go to the bottom and...
Here we go.
Maybe we should download it.
Well, that's what I'm doing. I'm going right through the website.
Okay.
Okay, so back to the slideshow. Okay, a few other things. When it comes to ethical theories, all of us have some preferred ethical standpoint. When you're assessing other people's ethical theories, whether they're actually understanding them, you don't have to be in agreement with them. You don't actually even have to care what you know, ethical theory is better than another. You don't have to know whether these theories are ultimately correct or not. That's all beyond the scope of assessing and using a rubric. You don't have to be concerned with other big picture issues like the origin of ethics. You could be, you might say, ethically agnostic on all of these points, and it would be perfectly fine for you and your students. So what are we going to cover? We're going to cover 5 different ethical theories, or you might say families of theories. Each one articulates a particular perspective on what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, or what we might call the realm of values. I'm going to go over just the most basic principles and key terminology. I'm not going to go very deep into any of these sort of things. I'm going to talk about a few important variations in these families of some of them, and then I'm going to talk about what to look for in student responses. That's what's really key here. How to tell if a student has knowledge of the theory, and how to tell if a student is correctly applying the theory. There's certain indices you could look for. So these are the 5 theories. Egoism, Utilitarianism, Deontology, or sometimes they call it duty-driven ethics, care ethics, and virtue ethics. There's another fairly common ethical system that comes up in business literature, contractarianism. I'm not covering that here. That's the idea of the social contract. And then there's a whole variety of things that are sometimes called justice ethics or rights ethics. But what those really consist in is just saying, here's a set of rights, you should follow these. That's not quite the same thing as having an ethical system. We can talk about that later. I'm going to put things on the website about that. That may be useful.
Can I just simply
Yes.
question? In all these theories, are some more applicable to some disciplines, like in the business, for example? When we talk about the justice theory, because in management we talked about distributive justice, organizational justice, different kind of justice. Therefore, justice theory is more applicable to business than other disciplines.
There are actually, well, there are a whole bunch of different things called justice theory to begin with. There's no one single thing that's actually called justice theory. So you always have to clarify which one do you mean. Do you mean, Rawlsian contractarian justice theory? Do you mean something like, Aristotelian understandings of distributive and commutative justice? So that requires some clarification. There are some other theories that are talked about a lot in the business language literature, business ethics literature, like stakeholder theory. But those tend to be derived from these. These are more basic. What gets called justice theory in many of the business ethics textbooks is basically just there are rights out there, you should observe the rights. These tend to be able to explain where rights come from. So these are more basic. And like I said too, we're not covering every single ethical theory. These are the ones that you do find in business literature, business ethics literature. Each of these is a well-developed system. We're not going to try to cover the entire system. You could spend the rest of your life researching and working on any one of these theories. One other thing I want to point out, sometimes people use other terms for these theories in rather confusing ways. So they may talk about consequentialism, and you're not sure whether they mean egoism or utilitarianism, which are both types of consequentialism. They'll talk about teleological ethics. Strictly speaking, that should only be used for certain types of virtue ethics. People end up using it in the field of ethics for all sorts of things. And so I actually try to avoid that language because I don't find it very helpful.
So one of the things is, too, if we could agree on ones that we want to reinforce in each class, even if the textbooks doesn't quite call it that way. So students always hear the same 5 principles theories. Right?
Well, I don't see that you have to confine yourself to these 5.
Okay.
Because, again, there are some other ones that students might be exposed to and use. Rights or justice theories.
They're very confusing,
yeah.
I think.
Contractarian, social contract theories. There's a number of different things. If you were in a Catholic school, you would be exposed to natural law ethics. And that's a large part of our educational establishment, actually. So those are discourses that are worth learning about. But I don't see how you have to master all of those.
You said non-theories. Why are those non-theories?
Relativism is not actually a theory. It's just a stance. It's this notion that there are no actual objective norms, that it's all relative to the individual. It's self-defeating, ultimately. It's a position that our students quite often come in with and have to be gradually weaned away from, in part because it's part of our culture. But it's not really an ethical theory. A relativist would simply say, well, do whatever you think is right. But then what do you think is right? That's what an ethical theory should supply you with. So let's start with egoism. Who are some famous proponents? I won't give you all of them. Ayn Rand is a very famous proponent of it. Adam Smith, to a certain degree, although I'm debasing his theory here, but you can say that he's a representative of it. What makes something good or bad from an egoist perspective is that it satisfies your desires or meets one's needs. Sometimes it's talked about in terms of self-interest as well. The basic principle behind it is the self-interest of the person doing, considering, or affected by the action. So you should do the action which most realizes or conduces to your own self-interest. That's what an egoist perspective says. Now, one important variation of this is the question of rational self-interest or enlightened self-interest. We're all familiar with actions which would be very pleasing right now, but would ultimately not be in our self-interest. And so we can distinguish between a sort of naive kind of egoism and rational egoism. So this is one I think is very familiar to you. I don't have to spend an awful lot of time on it. The conception of rational self-interest is basic to the models that you use in business and economics of human behavior. The second one I think is also very familiar to you, utilitarianism. Mill and Bentham are sort of the fathers of it. Peter Singer would be a good example of a contemporary representative. Here it's similar to egoism. It's in terms of what's pleasing to people or displeasing to people, except now you extend it to include everybody. Instead of simply focusing on the self, you focus on what produces the greatest amount of pleasure or lack of pain for the greatest amount of people. Bentham called this the greatest happiness principle. And the greatest happiness principle has a few different components to it. So you notice that you've got a word here, a term, greatest happiness principle, but then there's some other things packed into the concept. So one of these things is maximizing positive outcomes for the largest number of people, negative outcomes for the lowest number of people. A utilitarian is just fine with some people suffering as a result of an action. It's provided the majority of the people are going to benefit. One should choose the action which will lead to the greatest happiness overall. So if you have the possibility of choosing between two different actions, both of which are going to make people happy, but one can make people happier, you choose the one that makes people happier. Here's a key point. Here's how it differs from egoism in the greatest way. Your own pleasure and pain count only as much as everybody else's. So if you're a utilitarian, you would be okay with sacrificing your own self-interest to produce greater benefits for society as a whole. Whereas if you're an egoist, you certainly won't be that way. You'll see that as irrational. One important variation is quantitative utilitarianism versus qualitative utilitarianism. I don't think that that's going to be very applicable within a business setting because it requires you to make distinctions between different grades of pleasure and different grades of pain, and philosophers have never been able to come to agreement about how you do that. So I doubt whether it's going to be very useful to bring that up in a business context. If they can just get down quantitative utilitarianism, that's probably good. Now we totally shift gears. Deontology stresses duty. And some famous proponents of that would be Kant and, in the last century, W.D. Ross. For deontology, you're not interested in the consequences. You're not interested in whether it satisfies somebody's self-interest. You're interested in whether something conforms to a duty. And where do we get our conceptions of duty? Well, that comes about in different ways. The basic principle of it is fulfilling the duties that you have to yourself or to other persons. And you should choose the action which best conforms. So there may be a conflict. Sometimes you have to choose between several different duties. You choose the one which best conforms to one's recognized duties. Now the question then is, where do these come from? How do you figure out what your duties are? Kant thinks that you can recognize your duties by application of reason. And I'll show you some rules that he uses or provides you with in a moment. W.D. Ross thinks that provided you've got a fairly good moral compass, you should be able to sort of muddle these out on your own thinking about them. You don't have to actually reason about them. These are things that decent people recognize. And I realize that's rather problematic in our pluralistic culture as an assumption. So here's the variation. Kant says reason reveals our duty. This is probably going to remind you of things back in undergrad ethics days, right? Categorical imperative, that's the key term that Kant uses. I don't know that you need to use it in your classes, or that a student would have to come up with that. But these are the ways in which the categorical imperative can be framed in its most basic ways. Can the action be universalized? So given an action like, is it okay to cheat on my taxes? You would have to ask yourself, well, what are you actually doing there? And can you assume that would be okay for everyone to do? Can you universalize it? Can you say, well, everybody should cheat on their taxes? What would happen to society then? It wouldn't work. Or lying. Is it okay to lie, say, in making promises to pay back money that you have no intention of paying back? Well, if you universalize that, then even the concept of lying and truth wouldn't make any sense, because everyone would be lying all the time just to satisfy their interests. So that's not universalizable. That means that you have a duty not to lie, according to the Kantian perspective. The other way of thinking about these, and Kant thinks that these are actually going to be identical, is are you treating human beings as mere means to an end, or are you treating them also as ends? Are you treating people with dignity and respect? Or are you treating them just as tools? So that would be, those would be the sort of things you'd be looking for in student responses. Ross's version is a little bit more complicated because he doesn't have a basic rule that you can break this down to. He talks about what he calls prima facie duties, meaning duties that you just sort of recognize. And the first one of these is non-injury. Then there's fidelity, reparation, meaning paying people back what you owe, gratitude, beneficence, when you have the chance to do well to other people, you do so, justice, and even self-improvement. Now, again, we're not concerned here so much with are these correct or not, but I think you can probably see that it's a big assumption to think that everybody recognizes these. Think of our students. That's not exactly the case. The next one is care ethics. This one is a little bit less well defined. It's become popular in the last 20, 30 years. And Carol Gilligan, Virginia Held, those are two of the people early on. Michael Sloat has written an entire book about care ethics in which he argues that it could be a substantive ethics on its own. Originally, it was developed as a feminist response to other ethical systems, and it was saying that other ethical systems were leaving something out. People like Michael Sloat are trying to argue that it can be an ethic in its own right. What makes something good or bad, right or wrong from this perspective is that it involves caring for another person or it supports relationships with other people. And the basic principle is action which is caring towards those who are vulnerable or need support. So how should you decide to do things? Well, you should do the action which supports or nurtures other people, particularly those who are the most vulnerable, like children or workers subject to economic dislocations, those sorts of things. Like I put here, there's a lot of debate about whether this is really an ethical theory in its own right or whether it should be something to supplement other theories. Now, that's relevant here, in part because what are you doing when you're giving these cases to your students? You're asking them to consider things from several different ethical perspectives. So if this isn't a theory in its own right, that's okay. Because it's one more perspective that they can say, well, the utilitarian would say this, the egoist would say this, the care ethics person would add these considerations. So I don't think that it has to be an ethics that could stand on its own in order to be something that's worth, considering in student responses. And then last we have virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is older than these other ethics. Virtue ethics goes all the way back to people like Plato and Aristotle. You can find it in other cultures. Confucius is an example of somebody who is arguably a Chinese virtue ethicist. And it involves a different frame of reference. What makes an action good or bad is the character that it reflects. And one's character is either virtuous, or it's vicious, or it's somewhere in between, maybe neutral. A virtuous character has these virtues, these character traits that are habits that are recognized within the society as being good traits. A vicious person has the opposite. They have vices that are recognized as being bad traits. Now, in Aristotle's scheme and Confucius's scheme and other virtue ethicists' scheme, how do you tell what's really a virtue or a vice? You look at what conduces to human flourishing, what conduces to the realization of human potential. So courage, for example, is a virtue. Courage is a character trait. One can become courageous. It takes effort. Part of what you hopefully try to do in military training is learning how to be courageous in one of the paradigmatic senses of it, being able to stand up to fear on the battlefield. But courage has a lot of other applications. Being able to stand up for what one knows is the right thing in the face of pressure and not giving in, that's another example of that virtue of courage. At the other extreme would be cowardice. And how, are cowards simply people who just happen to fail? Virtue ethics would say, no, that's a character trait. that's a negative character trait, and it leads away from human flourishing. It leads away from realizing one's potential. So the basic principle for virtue ethics is a little bit more complicated. Actions that are reflective, that is, they show character, or they're productive, they lead towards character, or good or bad character, embodied in traits or habits. So again, nobody is automatically courageous or cowardly. We become that through the actions that we choose over and over again. Now there are important variations, and when it comes to virtue ethics, the variations really depend on which virtue ethicist you're looking at. On one of the handouts I gave you several different lists of virtues, and I don't know if do we have that one?
Let me make sure.
It'd be on the one that I sent for the...
The worksheet.
Yeah, it would be on the back of it, I believe. No?
I wouldn't worry about it now.
Some of them are still printing. They have
Okay.
the worksheet. I'm going to run back up there and see if that's printed.
Okay, well that'll be what comes along.
Would
So-
the Christian values come under that? You know,
Under virtue ethics?
Yeah.
Yes, as a matter of fact, many Christian ethicists have in fact been virtue ethics. Thomas Aquinas takes Aristotle and he fuses that with Christian ethics, bringing in, say, faith, hope, and charity as virtues. He's taking that from other earlier Christian ethicists. But I don't know. You can find Christian deontologists. You can find some Christian ethicists espousing something like an ethics of care as well.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
So you might say in some respects Christianity, and I suspect most other religious traditions are like this, is kind of a wax nose. You can bend it to fit many different ethical systems depending on what aspects you're focusing on.
Yeah, okay.
Do you guys have any other questions about these 5 ethical theories at this point? Okay, so I'll go on. So what should your student responses have? There's some basics for all student responses that tell you that they understand and can apply ethical theories. They have to be able to correctly identify the theory. So if they're writing about something and they're calling utilitarianism egoism, they're kind of fuzzy-headed about that. Then they have to be able to explain the theory. So when they're writing a response, if they really understand utilitarianism, they should be able to tell you a little bit about it. And you may have to put this in the instructions, or you may have to make this explicit to them, that we are going to judge you not just based on what, on a few things that you put on the paper, but on everything that you put on the paper. And if you don't show it to us, we don't know that you actually have those skills. Getting those general principles right. If they wind up somehow saying that egoism means that you should be charitable to everybody, they've gotten that principle wrong. Right? Application then. What they're going to do in application is take general principles that you've given them, and they're going to apply them to specific cases. They're going to say how they work out in those cases. And they can screw that up too. It's quite possible to start from the right information and draw the wrong conclusions. I see students doing that all the time. Some of you are familiar with the Collegiate Learning Assessment performance task tool that we're using a lot. And one of the areas that we look for is, do students actually look at the right evidence? Do they get the information right? And sometimes they mess that up. And sometimes they get all the information right and yet still somehow draw the wrong conclusions. So you have to downgrade them on that. To properly apply ethical theories, they have to actually, let's say they're applying virtue ethics in a given situation, they have to actually come up with the right answer that a virtue ethicist would come up with. They have to get the application right. And there's nothing to prevent you from giving them partial credit. And I think that's part of what the rubric does for you. So for each of these theories, I've worked out some basics of what you should be looking for. So for egoism, what should the student provide? they've got to invoke the principle of self-interest or something like it. They don't necessarily have to call it that, but they have to be able to provide you with something that you can identify as an analog to that. So they have to have something along these lines. What makes an action right is that it conforms to the self-interest of the person doing it. And one thing that a good response might point out is two different egoists might come to different evaluations of the same action depending on how it affects them. That's okay. That actually shows that they understand the theory well. So what do they have to do then? They have to be looking at the consequences that are likely to result from the action in the situation. It's not just enough to say, well, this is in my self-interest. They have to be able to identify what actually is in the person's interest. So they're probably going to have to invoke something like the principle of enlightened or rational self-interest in the kind of cases that you're giving them. Then they have to actually indicate to you that the theory would pick the choice that they're identifying as the best one. And again, you're probably going to have to coach your students to some degree about that, because I don't think, it seems like our students are not used to making things explicit. They're not used to putting their reasoning processes down. They're used to providing us with partial answers and expecting us to read into them. And we want to get our students to the point where they can actually provide us with full answers. Utilitarianism, what are they going to have to invoke with that? Something like the greatest happiness principle. Again, do they have to call it that? No, but they need to have something along those lines. Otherwise, you can't tell whether they're just talking about egoism. They need to say that what makes something good or bad is it produces the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. That has to be in there. It's the idea of maximizing pleasure, not just for themselves, but for everybody. Another key aspect is that there has to be some level of equality of who gets taken into account. Everybody gets taken into account. They need to be able to pick out which choice or a set of likely consequences is in fact likely to bring about the greatest happiness overall for all concerned. Now, how do utilitarians actually do this in practice? They actually tend to draw up lists and they start assigning numbers to things. I don't know that your students have to do that on, how long do you give them to do these tests? An hour?
Yeah, a class period.
Yeah, I don't know that they would actually have to draw up a full table of cost benefits for all the parties concerned, but they should at least be able to articulate something like that. I think, if it's going to be a good response, they should be able to at least tell you that they would do something like that. And then they have to say, hey, this is the choice that actually does maximize the pleasure for, or minimize the pain for all of those concerned. Deontology, a little bit different. We're not concerned with consequences with deontology. So there they have to invoke duty. They don't have to tell you that it's, the word duty. They could say it's what somebody ought to do, or it's what they should do. And they need to be able to tell you that the duty isn't just something that you thought up on your own, that it's something that other people could share. It's something that has to do with our rationality, or perhaps we discover it by intuition. It's not just enough to say that a person does have a duty. The person has to be able to identify what the duty is in general. If they're applying deontology, yeah.
Could you, I was wondering if you could help me answer a question that the student said the following. They said, we're not concerned with consequences.
Yeah.
But then someone says, should we cheat on our taxes?
Yeah.
Is this universalizable? What are the consequences of everybody?
Right. Yeah, that is a conundrum that comes up for Kantians in the literature. Is Kant really smuggling consequences back in? And the sort of standard Kantian response to that is, no, because it's just this sort of imaginary world where we're seeing whether the action in itself, if it was universalized, would really make sense. I tend to actually myself think that they are smuggling in consequences. But they're not doing so, they're not looking at consequences in the way that a utilitarian or an egoist is, where they're saying, these are the consequences. That's all I'm interested in. I'm not interested in whether we have an obligation to do this. Whether we have an obligation only depends on the consequences. For the Kantian, who's carrying out a thought experiment like that, the consequences are just something that you're using to figure out whether it can be universalizable. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
Well, that's good if it does, because that's one that I puzzled about for a long time, and I can never get a good response from the Kantians. I'm not a Kantian.
Can I ask a question? Are you
Sure.
making a distinction between the duty of a private citizen and the duty of a business?
Not at this point. No. That's a good.
Should we make that distinction?
That's a good question.
I mean, I think I was thinking, you know how you're reading increasingly that article in closures and they're
Yeah.
beating us up as consumers, saying you know you gotta pay for that house even though it's only worth 50% of the amount
Yeah.
that you pay. And on the other hand, businesses are obviously foreclosing, but that's for the good of their stakeholders, they're the stockholders. So,
Right, but that is not in terms of
isn't that
duty.
duty?
Well, that's not in terms of, if you talk about being for the good of their stockholders, they're carrying out something like a utilitarian calculation.
And if you think about
Yeah.
this, what we're doing with students versus what you would do as an organization,
Yeah.
isn't that really just a different stakeholder? So if they're analyzing a case from the individual perspective, there's going to, if they can identify the different stakeholders, like between the individuals and the
Yeah.
business as a whole, they may bring that up.
Yeah, and actually, I think this is a really good question. Deontological ethical theorists are usually looking only at persons in the sense of individual human beings.
Okay.
Each person has a duty.
But if you're a manager.
Well, let me go on.
Yeah, that's right. It's never a company.
Right.
Right.
It's always a
Well,
person.
again, these
Making
are
it-
ethical theories.
Yeah.
These are not. None of these actually wraps every single thing up. They all have vulnerabilities. So this may be a vulnerability of deontology, especially in a business ethics perspective. I know that Kant is interested in the responsibility of what we might call corporate persons, not in terms of business. He's interested in that in terms of politics, because he writes about what the responsibilities of one country can be to another country. Whether you could consider, I think this is the way a Kantian would address this. I think they would talk about the duties of the people composing the corporation,
Like the board of directors.
not about the corporation as being. We have the legal fiction of a corporation as being a person. I don't think a Kantian would look at it that way. But that is a good point. This could be a vulnerability of that system of ethics. And a really good student response, if a student is actually asking these sorts of questions and pointing that out, that would be a really great response, I think. Do you think you're going to have students?
I was just thinking that,
I don't think this is-
in a hospital setting,
Yeah.
you have your CEO, you also have your board, and you also have an ethics committee.
Yeah. Although
And,
in many cases they're
But,
stamping.
yeah, but that is, the structure in most
Yeah.
large systems. So you have an individual that's making decisions, then you have a board, each of which may have different ideas, but they discuss
Yeah.
and come to conclusions. And then you have an ethics committee that functions like that too. They all have different perspectives, but they come to a consensus
Yes.
to represent their organization. So that's interesting. I don't know how that fits within the theory.
Well, it doesn't fit within this very limited part of the project, but it ties in with a larger issue. Why do you study different ethical theories?
Right.
Well, in part because, at least the way I see it, and the way some other ethical theorists see it, no one single ethical theory that we're studying here actually manages to encompass everything that we want to encompass. So part of what you're training your students to do is to be able to look at things from different sides, which makes it possible for them to actually participate in that sort of consensus building, collaborative, reason-giving process later on down the line, instead of just saying, I know what's right, here it is, we're all done.
And that's what they were doing on some of the early responses. They were giving one, this is what should be done, and that's it. That's it.
Well, sooner or later we need to talk about the directions on some of these.
Well, yeah, we revised them recently, based on Simon and Greg's comments, so that, yeah.
Maybe some of the, just one second, maybe some of the tendency to throw out just one ethical theory and say, okay, here's the resolution, comes from the students thinking that the goal of the exercise is to find what fits them as just the right answer. And so they pick the ethical theory they agree with the most, and then they answer it from that perspective, and now they're done. And we could tell them, that's good, that's the start. Now add some more perspectives. Yeah.
Sure. I don't know specifically about the students here, but when they get in a functioning business organization, they're going to hear the term fiduciary duty a whole lot. And a lot of their decisions will be driven by that duty, which, unless I misunderstood you, said doesn't fit into your use of the term duty. But fiduciary duty is going to be a big...
It's a different sense of the term duty. It's a much more specific. Kant is talking in general terms. How can we determine what our duties are in general?
Right.
Fiduciary duties are usually fairly well defined within a given field.
Their general counsel will be telling them the definition of fiduciary duty on a fairly loud and regular basis.
Yes. And the same thing with, the codes of ethics for specific professions tend to be things that are fairly clearly defined. And they specify duties. What they mean by it is simply something you have to do. But they're not trying to say what is the origin of those duties, how do you tell what those duties are in different situations. They've just got a listing, basically. And provided you follow that listing, you stay out of trouble.
Where does the law fit in? Because some things are legal
Oh,
versus
that's a good question. Yeah.
Because some,
Could you, for example, if you were a deontologist, have a duty to disobey an unjust law? You could. If the law is something that is, say, debasing to humanity, if something requires me to treat you as merely a tool for my own interests, a conscience could say, based on that principle of not using people as mere means, a conscience could say that's a bad law. Virtue ethicists might do that as well. Martin Luther King's argument in Letter from a Birmingham Jail actually makes a claim about just and unjust laws. He's not invoking virtue ethics as such, but he talks about laws that debase humanity are unjust laws, laws that help to realize humanity are.
couldn't you say though that in an organization as a CEO or a board member or whatever, your duty is to do what's legal also?
That is a duty.
Because if you don't, so what is that?
That is a duty, not the whole scope.
So it could be considered under this theory?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, it could also fall under utilitarianism.
Right.
If you think about it, a society in which most people obey the law most of the time, provided the laws aren't structured in crazy ways, tends to work out for the greatest happiness of everybody, right? So a utilitarian can say, well, you ought to obey the law too, but purely based on the likely consequences if you don't do it, or if other people don't do it.
I was just thinking about some of the biggest ethics cases in business are about breaking the law.
Oh, and the consequences of what to do afterwards.
Let's start with what's legal.
Yeah.
So,
Let me go on to the next one, care ethics. Again, this one is a little bit trickier. In part because it's harder to say precisely what care ethics consists in. The theorists who engage in it, they tend to either make very broad claims or make very narrow claims. And sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly what they mean. They would have to invoke the principle of care or something like it. What would make an action good? These are the things you could look at. That it maintains relationships or supports relationships. It involves caring for, nurturing another person. Or another thing they bring up is empathy. And it's reflective of empathy, particularly towards those who are vulnerable. So this would be a perspective to complement the other ethical perspectives, I think. In order for them to have a good response, I think they have to be able to explain how the particular action actually fits that. They have to spell that out. Because it's not enough just to say, well, you know, they were nice to this person, therefore they're following care ethics. They have to actually tell us how being nice in this situation ties in with these somewhat more structured things. It could include discussion of how the consequences would affect those being cared for or not being cared for. And then they actually have to indicate to you, as they do with all the other theories, that it would pick this out as being the best choice. And then last, virtue ethics. They have to be able to invoke the idea that there are good character traits or good dispositional traits that we want people to have. They have to tell you that you know, what makes an action good or bad is that it reflects virtue or vice. Do they have to use those terms? Most of us don't use those terms, right? Most of us talk in terms of character or traits or what else do we use? Examples, sometimes models us. It's a bad example. They have to also tell you how that action fits in with that. So if they're going to say that a certain action is an example of courage, they need to spell that out for you and tell you how that action actually models or represents courage. If they're going to say it's an example of cowardice, they need to tell you a little bit more about that. They may look at the consequences of the action as providing a model to others. So a good response might include, well, if the CEO is doing this sort of thing, that's setting a bad example to everybody else, and then they're going to start following that bad example. And then they have to, again, indicate that this is what the theory would pick out as being the best choice. So any questions about how to apply these? Look at what to look for in student responses.
What case study do you
So,
use?
your suggestion is that we divide this into 5 categories like this?
No. I am only talking about 5 of the most common ethical theories that you could come across. There are other ethical theories out there.
But and it seems to me this is a handout is a little bit confused anyway,
Yeah.
because there are many different forms of utilitarianism, and egoism is just one form of it, and that is a sub-branch of
Yes.
consequences.
At the start of this, I began by saying,
Sorry.
this is just completely bare bones. I'm
Right.
here to help business faculty who don't have a big foundation in ethics with grasping some of the basics of the theory so that they can apply it to the rubric.
Anyway, my perspective is,
Yeah.
based on all the new insights in happiness studies and psychology and so on and so forth, and about the role and nature of emotions in ethical behavior, that we have kind of a different perspective on it. And I think, speaking just for myself, the only perspective that really makes sense is the virtue ethics perspective. In this particular sense, you can actually teach it in consequentialist terms,
Yeah.
where you can make a serious case
That's
for
interesting.
ethical behavior.
But
Yeah,
that's beyond the scope of this
Yeah.
workshop.
It is.
That's something for discussion afterwards. I'm actually a virtue ethicist myself. But I think it's very important to introduce students to these other
sure.
ethical
Ways to
theories. And one of the things, I don't know if you were here when I brought this up earlier, I tend to look at all these theories as things which allow us to have complementary aspects in looking at a situation. So I think it could be valuable for a student to be able to articulate what a utilitarian perspective, and I just mean a bare bones, straight out, cost-benefit, greatest happiness principle, not qualitative, just purely quantitative thing. I don't think it's right, but I think it's important for the student to be able to articulate that, and then look at it from this perspective, and then this perspective. Because that shows a capacity for the student to look at things from different perspectives. Yeah.
I'm just going to kind of go back to the basics of this, that the AACSB requires us to assess. And the best literature says they need to be able to pick out, you know, an ethical dilemma. They need to be able to apply different perspectives to it. Then they need to be able to say who the stakeholders are and how they would be impacted. And so the problem becomes just what you mentioned, because all of the textbooks use different terminology. Some of them are horrible. So every textbook that I have in my office, almost all of them have a chapter on ethics, and the terminology is different in every single one of them. So the question then becomes, and this is why this has been evolving over 2 years, is what do we want to do in the business school so we'll be consistent, and then how do we do it in the classroom? Because if we don't do that, we had dismal assessments first time around. And we need to be able to take all this back into the classroom and improve what we're doing. So that's kind of, you know, I appreciate what you're saying, because I get confused.
Let me make a distinction too. You talked about the one that we should be teaching. There's two senses of teaching in this. There's a sense of teaching as putting forward as the correct ethical theory. And that's what I hear you talking about. We should be teaching the thing that's coming out of the happiness literature and virtue ethics and all that. You're right. We also should, and this is what we do in ethics classes, we should teach all the other theories and point out why they may have vulnerabilities, you know, examine them in detail, see whether they can be applied, because you only actually know whether the theory works or not if you do try to apply it. And first you have to understand it. And so our students have to at least study them in order to know that they're not right. So, and this actually fits into, you know, sort of a virtue ethics Aristotelian theory. McIntyre is a good example. Someone would say that's precisely what you have to do. You have to take on other theories head on and show why they're not correct. So I think teaching in the sense that you're talking about entails teaching in the broader sense. You had a question.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask is I totally agree with Bert and the reason we're doing this.
Yeah.
But on the broader note,
Yeah.
what are the usefulness of these ethical theories in this era of globalization, when the question of relativism is always an issue? That beyond the Western world, all these theories are now applicable.
Well, let me give you an example. This is a really interesting one that's come up in healthcare. It comes up over and over and over again. What's right for the individual? If we apply it to every individual in the healthcare system, the country would go broke. So on these ethics committees, they bring in multiple perspectives, plus what's legal. You know, so if the ethics committee were not, if they were not able to see it, but from one perspective, it just is untenable. So to reach a consensus, then you have to discuss multiple perspectives. And so the best literature I could find, which was minimal, there's just not a lot out there about teaching business ethics in business schools. You know, this is almost, could be perceived as being groundbreaking because there's nothing out there. I'd like to model this because apparently every business school is going through this.
It's interesting too, though, when you bring up non-Western perspectives, there are non-Western virtue ethics, there are non-Western analogs of deontology, and there are non-Western analogs of utilitarianism within different traditions. And in the era of globalization, it actually does mean that Western ideas, like, say, utilitarianism, at a certain point cease being purely Western ideas as other people take them on. And these are the ethical theories that you're going to find most people talking about.
Yeah, well, my point is that some of this theory, emanating from the Christian doctrine has nothing to do with.
We're not actually in it. We're not in any
Islam.
But we're not. Yeah,
We're not talking Christian.
We're not in any theory that originated. All these are independent of Christian doctrine.
Yeah, I wasn't talking specifically of this factor. I was talking about generally the ethical theories.
Yeah, but I mean, you can also find within the world of Islam discussions that are structured deontologically. You can find utilitarian arguments being made. You certainly have a virtue ethics. You know, the discussions that actually go on in the application of Islamic law within the different schools. Those guys read Aristotle, some of them. And, yeah, Well, Averroes was a bit later, but
Yeah, but it was based on Aristotle, and that's the introduction of Aristotle into Islam.
I mean, the matrix, the cultural matrix, for those who are not simply operating out of the Hadith, includes Greek philosophy coming to them through the Syrian authors.
I think one of the value, though, to the students is to look at a case and not think that there's one right
One
answer.
solution.
And then if they, to help question how they think about right and wrong, and to realize that there are different perspectives about what's right and wrong in a situation.
It's really
Whether we
interesting.
call it ethics principles or
Yeah.
not.
It's interesting, Don, that you brought up the Christian perspective, because there's this saying that has been real popular for the last few years, what would Jesus do? Which goes right back to virtue ethics. And I can tell you, in healthcare, a lot of the students will revert back to what their faith tells them is right, like abortion and Catholicism.
I just saw a bumper sticker that said, "What would Scooby do?"
Yeah, what would Jimmy Buffett do? What would Jimmy Buffett do? I saw that on a bumper sticker the other day.
I think going back to Kathy's point, that it might be better, it's good for the students to be able to get away from there's one right answer and I can get it right away and put it down mentality, and get to there's not one right answer, there's several different answers, and then a higher level yet would be, there is a best answer, and I can say why it's the best answer, and provide some sort of rational justification for that, and address these other theories. And say why this theory is a better perspective than this theory.
In this situation.
Yes.
Don't you think, though, that in most cases of ethical issues and conflicts and so on and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
in most, not in all, and that's why they are different, in most cases, you get very similar arguments from a utilitarian perspective, virtue ethics perspective.
Yes, I'd agree that you get similar analyses of the situation, but I don't see that as a problem.
No, I think exactly. I think that's exactly the case, and maybe that's one of the things that one needs to emphasize.
Yeah.
And you
But,
can, I think.
I would disagree with the utilitarianism and virtue ethics, because sometimes it's a minority group that the utilitarianism principles overlook.
That's true.
And they can treat minorities fairly unhumanely.
Hey,
Well, let's go back to the
Peter
care
Singer
ethics.
is a utilitarian,
Yeah.
and he would totally disagree with you on that one.
Yeah, but Peter Singer also takes some pretty extreme positions.
Right. What I'm saying is you can have extreme utilitarian views.
He's certainly he's where utilitarianism goes.
Yes, exactly.
Well, let's go on with this, because this may address some of these
I might
issues.
do that. Okay.
The case that was used, when was it used? In one of your.
I think it was just back in 2007, and we used this originally, and this is the one that we'll be using again this semester. You should have a handout that says suggested case for assessment.
Yeah. This is the reporting inflated numbers case, and so I'm going to look at how should a student address this case using the ethical theories. We're not going to have a lot of time. I actually have to do a webinar over at Office of Faculty Development fairly shortly.
You may also want to
I'm going
pull
to skip
out
through some of this.
the grading rubric. We have a rubric developed to help faculty grade cases. So this go around, like this semester and this year, we'll be grading them with Greg's help, but eventually faculty should become comfortable using that rubric.
But note what he's asking us to do. He's asking us to look at it from each of the ethical principles, and that's not in the instruction.
No, we changed the directions.
But it should be
What do you
clear.
mean in the rubric? Yes, it's in there.
So I'm
No,
going
but I
to
mean
run through this, because
Okay,
I'm
right, you
running a
gotta
little
go.
bit short on
changed them,
time.
Kathy.
So,
okay.
if we're considering it from an egoist perspective, what would we look for? We have this character Barbara. She would have to look at what's in her immediate self-interest. What consequences would best match up with her interests, and what would go against her interests? And here she's in a culture of reporting inflated numbers.